The winter wind cut through Natalie Jordan's threadbare coat like 1,000 tiny knives as she huddled against the weathered planks of the silver-dollar saloon, her teeth chattering so violently she thought they might crack. She had been sitting there for nearly 2 hours, watching the snow fall in thick sheets across the muddy streets of Hangtown, California, wondering if this was how she would die alone, frozen, and forgotten in a gold-rush town that had long since lost its shine. The year was 1878, and the Sierra Nevada foothills showed no mercy to those without shelter when winter storms rolled through. Thomas Lawson pushed through the saloon doors, adjusting his hat against the biting wind as he prepared to make the ride back to his ranch. He had only come into town to pick up supplies and maybe share a whiskey with some of the other ranchers, but the storm had worsened considerably in the past hour. He was pulling his gloves on when he nearly stumbled over something someone pressed against the building's exterior wall. "Jesus," he muttered, dropping to one knee beside the huddled form. Through the swirling snow he could make out a woman's face, pale as death, her lips tinged blue. "Madam, Madam, can you hear me?" Natalie's eyes fluttered open and she tried to speak, but her jaw was locked from the cold. All she could manage was a weak nod. Thomas did not hesitate. He shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. She was small, he realized, and far too light, the kind of light that came from too many missed meals. Her dark hair was damp with melting snow, and he could feel her trembling against his chest. "I have got you," he said firmly, carrying her toward where his horse was tethered. "You are going to be all right." The ride to his ranch took 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. Thomas held Natalie in front of him on the saddle, one arm locked around her waist to keep her upright while the other guided his horse through the storm. She drifted in and out of consciousness, and each time her head lolled forward, his heart lurched with fear that he was already too late. When they finally reached his property, he dismounted in one fluid motion and carried her straight into the house, kicking the door open with his boot. The fire in the main room had burned down to embers, but it was still warm inside, blessedly warm compared to the brutal cold outside. He laid her carefully on the rug in front of the fireplace and immediately set about building up the fire, adding logs until flames roared back to life. Natalie's eyes opened again as warmth began to seep into the room. She found herself staring up at rough-hewn ceiling beams, the crackling of a fire filling her ears. A tall figure moved nearby, and she tried to sit up, panic flooding through her confusion. "Easy," Thomas said, kneeling beside her again. "You are safe. You were freezing outside the saloon. I brought you here to warm up." She stared at him, taking in his weathered face, the concern in his dark eyes, the snow still melting in his brown hair. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30, with the kind of build that came from years of hard ranch work. There was kindness in his face, but also a wariness, as if he was not entirely sure what to do with the half-frozen woman he had just rescued. Her voice came out as a croak and she coughed. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "Do not try to talk yet," Thomas said. He stood and went to the kitchen area, returning moments later with a cup of water. He helped her sit up, supporting her back with one hand while holding the cup to her lips with the other. "Drink slowly." The water was cool and clean, and Natalie drank it gratefully, feeling life returning to her limbs in painful increments. As sensation came back, so did the stabbing pain of frostbite in her fingers and toes. She gasped, and Thomas's expression grew more concerned. "Your hands," he said, setting the cup aside. He took her hands gently in his own, examining her reddened, swollen fingers. "And your feet, we need to warm them slowly or you could lose them. Do you understand?" She nodded, tears springing to her eyes. Now that she was safe, now that she was warm, everything she had been holding back came flooding to the surface. She had been so close to giving up, so close to just letting the cold take her. Hey now, Thomas said awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with her tears. You are all right. You are going to be fine. I am sorry, Natalie managed, her voice shaking. I did not mean to. I had nowhere else to go. You do not need to apologize, he said firmly. What is your name, Natalie? Natalie Jordan. Thomas Lawson, he replied. And you are going to stay here until this storm passes and you are well enough to move. No arguments. She looked at him, this stranger who had saved her life without a second thought, and felt something shift in her chest. Thank you, she whispered. Over the next hour, Thomas worked methodically to treat her frostbite. He filled a basin with lukewarm water and had her soak her hands and feet, gradually adding warmer water as her circulation improved. It was agonizing. The returning blood flow felt like thousands of needles jabbing into her skin, but he stayed beside her the whole time, talking to her to distract her from the pain. How did you end up outside that saloon? He asked, as he added more warm water to the basin. Natalie was quiet for a long moment. My husband died 6 months ago, she finally said. Influenza. We had come out here from Missouri, thinking we would make our fortune in the gold fields, but we never found much of anything except debt. When he died, I tried to keep going, but I lost our claim. Lost everything, really. I have been working wherever I could find it, but there is not much work for women in Hangtown. Thomas's jaw tightened. He had seen this story play out too many times, people coming west with dreams of gold, only to find hardship and heartbreak instead. You have no family back east. My parents died when I was young. My husband was all I had. She looked down at her hands in the water. I thought maybe I could find work in the saloon, but they did not need anyone. I was trying to decide what to do when the cold just got to be too much. I sat down to rest, and then I could not seem to get back up. Well, you are up now, Thomas said. And you are not going back out in that cold, not tonight and not until you have someplace safe to go. She met his eyes, searching for ulterior motives, but found only genuine concern. It had been so long since anyone had shown her kindness without expecting something in return that she hardly knew how to respond. As the evening wore on, Thomas made them both dinner, a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and cornbread, but it was the best thing Natalie had eaten in weeks. She sat wrapped in blankets by the fire, her feet propped up on a cushion, watching him move around the kitchen with practiced efficiency. The house was small but well-maintained, clearly the home of a man who took pride in his work. You run this ranch alone? She asked as they ate. Mostly, Thomas replied. I have got a few hands who come during branding and roundup, but day to day it is just me. Cattle ranching is not as glamorous as gold mining, but it is steady work if you know what you are doing. How long have you been here? 8 years. I came out from Texas after the war. I was just 18, looking to make a fresh start away from all the rebuilding and bitterness. Worked on other people's ranches for a few years, saved my money and bought this place 4 years ago. He paused, then added, It is not much, but it is mine. There was pride in his voice, and Natalie understood it completely. She had wanted that same sense of ownership, of building something that belonged to her and her late husband. Instead, she had lost everything. It is a good place, she said softly. They talked late into the night, the storm raging outside while the fire kept them warm and safe. Thomas told her about his cattle, about the challenges of ranching in the Sierra Nevada foothills, about the satisfaction of watching his herd grow year by year. Natalie told him about Missouri, about her childhood working in a boarding house, about meeting her husband and believing they could build a better life together. Finally, when exhaustion began to weigh on both of them, Thomas stood and gathered more blankets from a chest. "You take my bed," he said. "I will sleep out here by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Natalie protested. "You can and you will," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You need proper rest to recover. Besides, I have slept in worse places than in front of a warm fire." She did not have the energy to argue further. He helped her to the bedroom, supporting her weight as her feet were still too tender to walk on properly. The bed was simple but clean, and she sank into it gratefully. "Thank you, Thomas," she said as he turned to leave. "You saved my life tonight." He looked back at her, silhouetted in the doorway. "Get some rest, Natalie. We will figure everything else out in the morning." When Natalie woke the next day, pale sunlight was streaming through the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in white. She could hear Thomas moving around in the main room, and the smell of coffee drifted through the house. Gingerly, she tested her feet and found that while they were still sore, the worst of the pain had subsided. She emerged from the bedroom wrapped in one of his blankets to find him pouring coffee at the stove. He looked up and gave her a small smile. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said. "Still sore, but better." "Good. Sit down and have some breakfast. We need to keep your strength up." As they ate, Natalie found herself studying him more closely in the daylight. He had a strong, honest face, lined from years of working outdoors. His hands were calloused and scarred from ranch work, but they were careful and gentle when they had tended to her injuries. There was something steady about him, something that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in a very long time. "The storm has passed," Thomas said after a while, "but there is several feet of snow out there. It will be a few days before the roads are clear enough for travel. If you are amenable to it, you are welcome to stay here until then." Natalie nodded slowly. "I do not want to impose." "You are not imposing," he said firmly. "The truth is, I could use some help around here if you are feeling up to it. Nothing strenuous, but there are always chores that need doing, and I am not much of a cook. If you wanted to earn your keep, there is plenty of work." She understood what he was doing, giving her a way to stay without feeling like charity. It was a kindness that made her throat tighten with emotion. "I would be happy to help," she said. Over the following days, they fell into an easy routine. Natalie's strength returned gradually, and she began taking over the cooking and lighter household tasks. Thomas spent his days tending to his cattle, making sure they had access to food and water despite the snow. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, sharing stories about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Natalie found herself looking forward to those evenings more than she wanted to admit. There was something magnetic about Thomas, something that drew her in despite her determination to remain guarded. He was thoughtful and attentive, but never overbearing. He made her laugh with stories about ornery cattle and the other ranchers in the area. And sometimes, when the firelight caught his face just right, she felt her heart skip in a way it had not since long before her husband died. Thomas, for his part, was acutely aware of Natalie's presence in his home. For 4 years, he had lived alone, content with his solitary life. But having her here changed something fundamental about the space. The house felt more alive with her in it. He found himself hurrying through his work so he could get back to her sooner. He caught himself thinking about her smile while he was out checking fence lines. It was dangerous territory, and he knew it. One evening, about a week after he had found her, Thomas came in from the barn to find Natalie standing at the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. There was something melancholy in her expression that made him pause. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. She did not turn around. "I was thinking that the roads will be clear soon, that I will need to figure out what comes next." Thomas's chest tightened. He had been avoiding thinking about that reality, but it was inevitable. You could stay in Hangtown, he said. Look for work there. Doing what? She asked, finally turning to face him. There was no work before, and there will not be any now. I will end up in the same situation, or worse. Then do not go back to Hangtown. The words were out before Thomas could stop them. Natalie looked at him, her eyes wide. What do you mean? He took a deep breath, knowing he was about to step off a cliff. Stay here, on the ranch. I meant what I said about needing help. You are good at what you do. The house has never been this organized, and I have not eaten this well in years. I could pay you a fair wage, and you would have room and board. Thomas, I cannot just— Why not? He challenged. You need work, I need help. It makes sense. She studied his face, trying to read what was beneath the practical offer. Is that the only reason you want me to stay? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Thomas could have deflected, could have kept things safe and uncomplicated. Instead, he chose honesty. No, he said quietly. It is not the only reason. I have enjoyed having you here, Natalie, more than I expected to. The house feels different with you in it. Better. I feel different. But I did not want to say anything because I know you are still grieving your husband, and I did not want to make you uncomfortable or feel obligated. Natalie's breath caught. She had felt it too, this growing connection between them, but she had been afraid to acknowledge it. Part of her felt guilty her husband had not been dead even a year. But another part of her, the part that had been numb for so long, was starting to feel alive again. I am still grieving, she said slowly. But not in the way you might think. My husband and I, we cared for each other, but it was not a grand passion. We were partners trying to survive. When he died, I mourned him, but I also mourned the future we had planned, the life we were supposed to build together. She paused, gathering her courage. These past few days with you have reminded me that there are different kinds of futures possible, different kinds of connections. Thomas took a step closer. What are you saying? I am saying that I would like to stay, Natalie said. Not just because I need work, but because I want to see where this goes, whatever this is between us. The smile that spread across Thomas's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I would like that too. They did not rush into anything. Thomas was patient, giving Natalie space to adjust to her new situation while still making his intentions clear. He courted her in small, thoughtful ways, bringing her wildflowers when he found them poking through the snow, taking her riding around the property on gentler days, teaching her about the ranch and the cattle. Natalie responded in kind, learning what he liked to eat, mending his clothes, leaving small surprises for him to find. The physical attraction between them grew steadily. There were moments when their hands would brush and neither would pull away. Times when Thomas would come in from outside and catch Natalie watching him with a look that made his pulse race. Evenings when they sat close by the fire, the space between them charged with possibility. It was on a clear night in early March, with the first hints of spring in the air, that things finally shifted. They had been sitting by the fire as usual, talking about plans for the ranch in the coming year. Thomas wanted to expand his herd, and Natalie had suggestions about crops they could plant for additional income. The conversation had drifted into comfortable silence when Natalie suddenly spoke. I am ready, she said softly. Thomas looked at her, his heart pounding. Ready for what? For this. For you. She met his eyes, her own shining in the firelight. I have been holding back because I thought I should, because I thought it was too soon or wrong somehow, but it does not feel wrong. Being with you feels like the first right thing that has happened to me in years. Thomas reached out and cupped her face gently in his hand. Are you sure? I am sure. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of all the longing he had been keeping in check. Natalie melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt as she kissed him back with equal fervor. It felt like coming home, like finding something she had not even known she was looking for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you, Natalie Jordan." "I am falling in love with you too, Thomas Lawson." That night, she did not sleep in his bed alone. They came together with a passion tempered by tenderness, learning each other's bodies and hearts in equal measure. Thomas was gentle and attentive, making sure Natalie felt cherished and desired. She responded with a fire that surprised them both, all the emotions she had been suppressing pouring out in their lovemaking. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. Natalie traced patterns on Thomas's chest, marveling at how safe she felt in his arms. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we build a life together," Thomas said simply. "If that is what you want." "It is," she whispered. "More than anything." Spring arrived properly in April, transforming the landscape from white to green seemingly overnight. Natalie threw herself into life on the ranch with enthusiasm, learning everything Thomas could teach her about cattle ranching. She proved to have a natural talent for it, and Thomas found himself relying on her judgment more and more. Their relationship deepened as the months passed. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, building a partnership that was as practical as it was romantic. Thomas had never imagined that he could be this happy, that life could feel this full. Natalie, for her part, felt as though she had been given a second chance at everything. In June, Thomas asked her to marry him. It was not a grand romantic gesture. They were mending fence in the far pasture when he suddenly turned to her and said, "I think we should get married." Natalie looked up from the fence post she was hammering, sweat dripping down her face, and laughed. "Is that a question or a statement?" "Both," Thomas said, grinning. "What do you say?" "I say yes, you ridiculous man." They married in July in a simple ceremony at the small church in Hangtown. A few of the other ranchers attended, along with the shopkeepers who had gotten to know them over the past months. Natalie wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Thomas had bought in Sacramento, and Thomas wore his best suit, which was still dusty from ranch work. It did not matter. When they said their vows, looking into each other's eyes, nothing else existed but the two of them and the life they were building together. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. The ranch demanded constant work, and there were setbacks: a dry summer that stressed the herd, a broken wagon wheel that took weeks to replace, a barn roof that needed emergency repairs during a thunderstorm. But they faced everything together, and somehow that made even the hardest days bearable. Natalie discovered she was pregnant in early autumn. She had been feeling tired and queasy for a few weeks before she connected the symptoms, and when she told Thomas, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy, before carefully setting her down and apologizing profusely for being too rough. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she teased, but she was deeply touched by his concern. Thomas became even more protective as her pregnancy progressed. He tried to take over all her chores, insisting she rest, until Natalie finally had to sit him down and explain that she would go mad if she could not do anything. They compromised. She would handle the lighter tasks and let him know immediately if she felt unwell. The pregnancy was not easy. Natalie suffered from severe morning sickness in the early months, and as winter set in again, she found herself confined to the house more than she liked. Thomas did everything he could to keep her comfortable and entertained, reading to her in the evenings and bringing her interesting things he found around the property. On a frigid night in late January 1880, almost exactly 2 years after Thomas had found her freezing outside the saloon, Natalie went into labor. Thomas rode through the snow to fetch the midwife from Hangtown, his heart in his throat the entire way. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Thomas thought he might lose his mind from worry. But Natalie was strong, stronger than he had ever given her credit for, and just before dawn, their son was born. They named him William Thomas Lawson, and he had his mother's dark hair and his father's eyes. Thomas held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the depth of his love for this tiny person and for the woman who had given him this incredible gift. "Thank you," he whispered to Natalie, who looked exhausted but radiant in the lamplight. "We made him together," she said softly. "Everything good in my life I have made with you." The early months of parenthood were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. William was a colicky baby who did not sleep well, and both Thomas and Natalie spent many nights pacing the floor with him. But there were also moments of piercing joy. William's first smile, the way he would quiet when Thomas sang to him, the fierce love that flooded Natalie every time she looked at her son. As William grew from infant to toddler, the ranch grew too. Thomas's careful management and Natalie's business sense paid off, and they were able to expand their herd significantly. They hired 2 permanent ranch hands, which took some of the burden off Thomas and allowed him to spend more time with his family. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and exciting. Natalie and Thomas's love for each other deepened with every passing year, weathering the storms that inevitably came with building a life together. They had their disagreements. Of course, Natalie thought Thomas was too cautious with money, while Thomas thought Natalie took on too much and never asked for help when she needed it. But they always talked things through, always came back to the foundation of respect and affection that underlay everything they did. When William was 3, Natalie became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the spring of 1883 they welcomed a daughter they named Sarah Rose. She was a placid, happy baby, the opposite of her brother in temperament, and she completed their family in a way none of them had known was missing. The years that followed were full and rich. William grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who followed his father everywhere, determined to learn everything about ranching. Sarah was more interested in the natural world around her, collecting rocks and flowers and insects with equal enthusiasm. Thomas and Natalie watched their children grow with pride and wonder, marveling at how 2 people who had started with nothing had built something so precious. There were hard times, too. In 1885, a harsh winter decimated their herd, and they had to take out loans to rebuild. In 1887, William fell from a horse and broke his arm, giving Thomas nightmares for weeks afterward. In 1889, Natalie's old grief caught up with her unexpectedly, and she spent several days weeping for the husband she had lost and the life that might have been. Thomas held her through it all, understanding that loving him did not erase her past, only added to it. But the good times far outweighed the bad. There were summer evenings when the whole family would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains. There were holidays celebrated with neighbors who had become friends. There were quiet moments between Thomas and Natalie, stolen kisses in the barn or late-night conversations after the children were asleep, when they would remind each other of how far they had come. On a winter evening in 1893, 15 years after Thomas had found Natalie freezing outside the saloon, they sat together on that same porch, watching William, now a gangly 13-year-old, teach Sarah how to rope a fence post. The children's laughter carried on the cold air, and Natalie leaned into Thomas's warmth, his arm automatically coming around her shoulders. "You ever think about that night?" Thomas asked. "The night I found you, all the time," Natalie admitted. I think about how close I came to giving up. How different everything would be if you had not come out of that saloon when you did. I think about it too, Thomas said. I almost did not. I almost decided to wait out the storm inside, have another drink, but something made me leave when I did. Fate, Natalie suggested. Maybe, Thomas agreed. Or maybe just dumb luck. Either way, finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Natalie turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life and then given her a reason to live it fully. His hair was graying now, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there 15 years ago, but he was still the steady, kind man who had wrapped her in his coat and refused to let her freeze. "I love you," she said, "more than I can ever put into words." "I love you too," Thomas replied, kissing her forehead. "Always have, always will." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. In the distance, cattle lowed softly. Inside the house, the fire Thomas had built that morning still crackled in the hearth, keeping everything warm and safe. It was an ordinary moment, the kind they had shared thousands of times before, but it felt sacred nonetheless. William successfully roped the fence post and let out a whoop of triumph. Sarah clapped and demanded he teach her immediately. Thomas and Natalie watched, smiling at their children's antics, grateful beyond measure for the life they had built together from that single cold night and Thomas's simple act of kindness. As winter deepened, and 1893 turned into 1894, the Lawson family continued to thrive. The ranch was prosperous, the children were healthy and happy, and Thomas and Natalie's love remained the bedrock upon which everything else was built. They had survived loss and hardship, had celebrated victories and weathered defeats, and through it all, they had each other. One particularly cold evening in February, Natalie found herself unable to sleep. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Thomas, and padded through the house to the main room. The fire had burned down to embers, but she did not bother to rebuild it. Instead, she stood at the window, looking out at the snowy landscape illuminated by moonlight. This house, this ranch, this life, it all seemed miraculous from where she stood now. 16 years ago, she had been a widow with nothing, literally freezing to death outside a saloon because she could not see any way forward. Now she was a wife, a mother, a partner in a successful ranching operation. She had purpose and joy and a family that loved her unconditionally. "Cannot sleep." Thomas's voice came from behind her, warm and sleep-rough. Natalie smiled without turning around. "Just thinking." He came to stand beside her, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. Dangerous occupation, thinking in the middle of the night. "I was thinking about how lucky I am," Natalie said. "How lucky we are." "Luck had something to do with it," Thomas agreed. "But you did the rest. You could have given up that night, but you did not. You could have left when the storm cleared, but you stayed. You chose this life, Natalie. You built it with your own two hands." "We built it," she corrected. "Together." "Together," Thomas echoed, pulling her closer. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in blankets and each other, watching the moonlight on the snow. Behind them, the house was full of the quiet sounds of their children sleeping. Around them, the ranch stretched out in all directions, a testament to their hard work and dedication. And between them flowed the love that had sustained them through everything, the love that had started with one man's refusal to let a stranger freeze, and had grown into something vast and unshakable. As the years continued to pass, Thomas and Natalie settled more deeply into their roles as parents and ranchers. William, showing his father's steady temperament and his mother's sharp mind, became increasingly involved in running the ranch. By the time he was 16, he was doing the work of a full-grown man, and Thomas began to think seriously about the future of the operation. Sarah, meanwhile, had discovered a passion for teaching. She loved working with the younger children in Hangtown when they visited town, and she talked often about wanting to become a schoolteacher when she was old enough. Natalie encouraged her daughter's ambitions, remembering her own younger self and the limited options she had faced. In 1898, when William was 18 and Sarah was 15, the family faced a significant decision. A neighboring rancher, getting on in years, wanted to sell his property and retire to Sacramento. The land bordered the Lawson Ranch and would nearly double their acreage, but it would also require a substantial investment and more hands to manage. Thomas and Natalie debated the decision for weeks. It was risky. They would have to take out a sizable loan, and there was no guarantee the expansion would pay off. But they also knew that opportunities like this did not come often, and the additional land would secure their children's futures. One evening, they called a family meeting around the dinner table. It was something they had started doing as the children got older, including them in major decisions rather than simply telling them what would happen. "Your father and I have been discussing the Morrison property," Natalie began. "We wanted to hear your thoughts before we make a final decision." William, who had grown into a tall, serious young man with his father's build and his mother's dark eyes, spoke first. "I think we should do it. The land is good, and with proper management we could significantly increase our cattle production. I am willing to take on more responsibility to make it work." "It is a lot of debt," Thomas cautioned. "A lot of risk." "Everything worth doing involves risk," William countered, then grinned. "Someone wise told me that once." Thomas laughed, recognizing his own words thrown back at him. "Fair enough." "What about you, Sarah?" Natalie asked. "This decision affects your future too." Sarah, who had inherited her mother's thoughtful nature and her father's honest directness, considered carefully before answering. "I think you should buy it if it makes sense for the ranch, but I also think you should know that I do not want to be a rancher. I want to teach." There was a moment of silence. Thomas looked at Natalie, who reached out and took Sarah's hand. "We know that, sweetheart. We have always known that, and we support you completely." "The ranch will be William's someday," Thomas added, "if that is what he wants. But there will always be money for you to pursue your dreams too, Sarah. That is why we work so hard, so you both can have choices." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." They bought the Morrison property in the spring of 1898, and the expansion was everything they had hoped for and more challenging than they had anticipated. The additional land required more cattle, more horses, more equipment, and more hands. Thomas hired 3 new ranch hands and promoted one of his longtime workers to foreman. William threw himself into learning every aspect of the expanded operation, often working 16-hour days alongside his father. Natalie, meanwhile, managed the business side of things with the same sharp intelligence she had always brought to everything she did. She negotiated with suppliers, kept meticulous records, and made sure they stayed on top of their loan payments. It was exhausting work, but it was also exhilarating to see their enterprise growing and succeeding. Sarah finished her schooling in Hangtown, and at 18 was offered a position as an assistant teacher at the very school she had attended as a child. The pride on Thomas and Natalie's faces when she told them was almost overwhelming. Their daughter was going to have opportunities they had only dreamed of, was going to make her own way in the world on her own terms. In 1902, William met a young woman named Emily at a church social. She was the daughter of another rancher, a practical, hard-working woman with a quick laugh and a kind heart. Thomas and Natalie liked her immediately, and when William asked their permission to court her, they gave it gladly. The courtship lasted a year, and William and Emily married in the summer of 1903. It was a joyful celebration, with seemingly the entire county turning out for the wedding. As Thomas watched his son exchange vows with his new bride, he thought back to his own wedding 26 years earlier. So much had changed since then, but the essential thing remained the same. Love was still the foundation of everything. Emily moved into the ranch house, and Natalie found herself enjoying having another woman around. Emily was eager to learn and full of ideas for improving various aspects of the operation. The two women became close, more like friends than mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, and Thomas often joked that he was hopelessly outnumbered now. In 1904, Emily gave birth to Thomas and Natalie's first grandchild, a boy they named James. Becoming grandparents was a strange and wonderful experience for both of them. Thomas, who had been such a young father with William, was more relaxed with his grandson, able to simply enjoy the child without the weight of responsibility he had felt the first time around. Natalie, meanwhile, marveled at how much more energy she had for a grandchild than she had had for her own children, though she suspected that had more to do with being able to hand James back when he cried than with any real increase in stamina. Sarah, now a fully qualified teacher, was courted by the town's new doctor, a thoughtful man named Matthew Harris who had moved to Hangtown from Boston. Natalie was initially concerned about the match. She worried that Matthew, who came from money and education, might look down on Sarah's more humble origins. But when she met him, she realized immediately that he was genuinely in love with her daughter and respected her completely. Sarah and Matthew married in 1905, and while Sarah continued teaching for a few more years, she eventually had to stop when she became pregnant with their first child. She missed teaching, but she threw herself into motherhood with the same enthusiasm she had brought to everything else. She and Matthew had 2 daughters in quick succession, and family gatherings became loud, chaotic, joyful affairs full of children and laughter. As Thomas and Natalie entered their 50s, they began to step back from the day-to-day running of the ranch. William had proven himself more than capable of managing the operation, and with Emily's help, the ranch continued to prosper. Thomas still went out to work with the cattle most days. He was not ready to fully retire, but he no longer carried the weight of every decision on his shoulders. This new freedom gave Thomas and Natalie time to simply be together in ways they had not been able to since the early days of their relationship. They would take long rides around the property, just the two of them, reminiscing about the years they had spent building their life together. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching their grandchildren play. They rediscovered the simple pleasure of each other's company, unencumbered by the constant demands of work and parenting. One warm summer evening in 1908, exactly 30 years after Thomas had found Natalie outside the saloon, they decided to ride into Hangtown. They had not been to town together in months, and Natalie wanted to see how much it had changed. The gold rush was long over now, and Hangtown had transformed from a rough mining camp into a respectable small town with proper shops and a new town hall. As they rode down the main street, now properly paved, Natalie felt a strange sense of displacement. This place looked nothing like the desperate town where she had nearly died. But then Thomas steered his horse toward a familiar building, and Natalie's breath caught. The Silver Dollar Saloon was still there, though it had been renovated and expanded. The weathered planks where she had huddled in the cold had been replaced with proper siding, and the whole building looked prosperous and welcoming. "You want to go in?" Thomas asked. Natalie considered, then shook her head. "No, I do not need to. I just wanted to see it again." They sat on their horses, looking at the saloon in silence, Finally, Natalie spoke. I was so lost that night, so hopeless. I did not think I had any reason to keep fighting. I know, Thomas said quietly. If you had not come out when you did, she stopped, unable to finish the thought. But I did, Thomas said firmly. I did come out and I found you, and everything that came after everything we built together, that is real. That is what matters. Natalie turned to look at her husband, this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. His hair was completely gray now, and his face was weathered from decades of working outdoors, but his eyes were still the same, warm and steady and full of love. "You ever regret it?" she asked, taking in a half-frozen stranger. "Your life would have been so much simpler if you had just left me there." Thomas reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "Not for one single second. Finding you was not just about saving your life, Natalie. It saved mine too. I was existing before you, just going through the motions. But you made me live. You made me feel. You gave me a family and a purpose beyond just surviving. So no, I do not regret it. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." Tears streamed down Natalie's face, but she was smiling. "I love you so much. I love you too. Always." They rode home slowly, taking their time, talking and laughing and enjoying the warm evening air. When they reached the ranch, they could see lights blazing in the main house and hear the sounds of their family gathered for dinner. William and Emily were there with their children. They now had 3, with another on the way. Sarah and Matthew had driven out from town with their 2 daughters. As Thomas and Natalie dismounted and walked toward the house hand in hand, they paused to take in the scene. Through the windows, they could see their children laughing, their grandchildren playing, the life they had built continuing and growing beyond anything they could have imagined that cold winter night 30 years ago. "We did good," Thomas said softly. "We did very good," Natalie agreed. They went inside to join their family, and the house erupted in greetings and hugs. Little James, now 4 years old, immediately claimed his grandfather's attention, demanding a horsey ride. One of Sarah's daughters showed Natalie a drawing she had made. Emily was trying to keep the littlest ones from pulling all the bread off the table before dinner was ready. It was chaos and noise and utterly perfect. After dinner, when the children were playing outside in the last of the evening light and the adults were cleaning up, Sarah came to stand beside her mother at the window. "You look happy, Mama," she said. Natalie smiled. "I am happy, very happy." "You and Papa, you have something special," Sarah continued. "Matthew and I talk about it sometimes. The way you still look at each other after all these years. We hope we can have that too." "You will," Natalie assured her. "Marriage is work and there will be hard times. But if you choose each other every day, if you face everything together, you will build something that lasts." Sarah hugged her mother tightly. "Thank you for showing me what love is supposed to look like." That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Thomas and Natalie sat together by the fire in the main room, the same fire where Natalie had first thawed out 30 years earlier. Thomas added another log, and the flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Do you remember the first night I was here?" Natalie asked. "When we sat right here and talked for hours." "I remember everything about that night," Thomas said. "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever met, even though you probably felt anything but brave." "I remember thinking you were going to make me leave in the morning," Natalie admitted. "I was so afraid that once I was warm and safe, you would send me back out into the world." "I could never have done that," Thomas said. "Even then, before I knew I could not let you go." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but it was a gentle summer breeze, nothing like the howling winter storm that had brought them together. The house creaked and settled around them, full of the memories of 30 years of life and love. "Thomas," Natalie said softly. "Yes, thank you for finding me." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you for letting me." The years continued to roll by with increasing speed. The ranch prospered under William's management, eventually becoming one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. Emily proved to be not just a supportive wife, but a shrewd businesswoman in her own right, developing new markets for their beef in San Francisco and beyond. They had 5 children in total, each one adding to the growing Lawson legacy. Sarah became known as one of the best teachers in the county, beloved by her students and respected by their parents. Even after she had her own children, she found ways to continue teaching, eventually starting a small school in her home for children whose families could not afford to send them to the regular school. Matthew's medical practice thrived, and together they became pillars of the Hangtown community. Thomas and Natalie watched it all with quiet pride. They had started with nothing less than nothing, really, considering Natalie had been on the verge of freezing to death and had built an empire of sorts. Not an empire of money or power, but an empire of love and family and legacy. Their children were happy and successful. Their grandchildren were healthy and thriving, and they still had each other. As they moved through their 60s, their health remained relatively good, though Thomas's joints ached in cold weather and Natalie had to be more careful about not overexerting herself. But they were still active, still involved in the ranch and their children's lives, still deeply in love with each other. In 1915, the world beyond their California ranch was engulfed in war. Europe was tearing itself apart, and while America was not yet involved, the conflict cast a long shadow. Thomas and Natalie, who had lived through the aftermath of the Civil War and remembered the scars it left, prayed that their grandchildren would never have to see such horror. But they also knew that the world was changing rapidly. The old ways of the West were fading. Automobiles were becoming common, even in rural areas. Electricity was starting to reach beyond the cities. The wild, lawless frontier that had defined their youth was becoming civilized, settled, tamed. "You miss it?" William asked his father one day as they watched a motor car struggle up the road to the ranch. The Old West, Thomas considered the question carefully. "Some parts of it," he admitted. "I miss the sense that anything was possible, that you could build something from nothing if you were willing to work hard enough. But I do not miss the violence or the uncertainty or the desperation. And I think the world my grandchildren are inheriting your children is better in most ways than the one I grew up in. Even with wars and automobiles and all this change, especially with all this change," Thomas said, "change means progress. It means people like your mother, who would have had no options in an earlier time, can build businesses and own property and make their own choices. It means your sister can be a teacher instead of just a wife. It means my grandchildren will have opportunities I could not even dream of at their age." William smiled. "You are an optimist, Papa." "No," Thomas corrected gently. "I am a man who married an optimist, and she taught me to see the world through her eyes. In 1918, the war finally ended and America celebrated. The Lawson family gathered at the ranch for a huge celebration, with neighbors and friends joining them for a barbecue that lasted well into the night. Thomas, now 70 years old, found himself surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. William's oldest had recently married and had a baby of her own. As the party wound down and people began to head home, Thomas found Natalie sitting alone on the porch, watching the stars come out. He lowered himself carefully into the chair beside her, his joints protesting the movement. Getting old is not for the weak, he muttered, and Natalie laughed. We have earned every ache and pain, she said. Look at what we have built. Thomas followed her gaze to where their family was saying goodbye to guests, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all mixed together in a beautiful chaos. We did all right, he agreed. Better than all right, Natalie said. Thomas, when I think about where I was 40 years ago, when I remember how close I came to just giving up, her voice broke, and Thomas reached over to take her hand. But you did not give up, he said firmly. You fought, you survived, and then you thrived. That was all you, Natalie. I just gave you a warm fire and a place to rest. You gave me everything, she whispered. You gave me a reason to keep fighting. You gave me love and a family and a life beyond anything I could have imagined. You saved me, Thomas. We saved each other, he corrected. I was just going through the motions before you came along. You made me want more from life. You made me want to build something that mattered. They sat in silence, holding hands as the last of their guests departed. Finally, when it was just family left, William came to the porch. Papa, Mama, we are going to head home. Thank you for hosting tonight. It was perfect. Thomas and Natalie stood to hug their son goodbye. Emily hugged them next, followed by their grandchildren. Sarah and Matthew's family left soon after, and then it was just the two of them again, alone in the house where they had built their life together. Natalie stood at the window, looking out at the ranch bathed in moonlight. Thomas came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. No regrets, he asked softly. Not a single one, Natalie replied. Everything I have, everything I am, started the night you found me freezing outside that saloon and brought me home to your fire. You are my home, Thomas. You always have been. And you are mine, he murmured, holding her close. They stood like that for a long time, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and had built a love story that would echo through generations. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. As they finally turned away from the window and headed to bed, hand in hand as always, the fire in the hearth burned low but never went out, just like the love that had sustained them through 4 decades of life together. It was a love that had started with an act of kindness on a cold winter night and had grown into something vast and unshakable, something that would endure long after they were gone, carried forward by the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren they had created together. Thomas and Natalie climbed into bed, fitting together as naturally as they had every night for 40 years. As sleep claimed them, they were both smiling, content in the knowledge that they had lived well, loved deeply, and built something that would last far beyond their own lives. The ranch would continue. Their family would continue. And somewhere, in the hearts of everyone who knew them, the story would continue to the story of a woman who was freezing outside a saloon and a cowboy who brought her home to his fire, and how that single moment of compassion had blossomed into a lifetime of love.